what this video comes down to is the fact that when I had my old Olympus EM5 Mark II, which is the very first camera I ever bought brand new, my very first Micro Four Thirds camera, I fell in love with it, and to this day, it's one of my favorite cameras I've ever owned. Now, one of the favorite lenses I ever owned on any camera for any system was the Olympus 45mm f1.8 that went on that camera, which is this lens right here. This was my ride or die. I could do everything with this lens. I had never fallen so completely in love with a piece of gear the way I did with this lens, or similar to how I did with my EM5 Mark II, but this lens, there's just some magic about it. It was this perfect balance of small, lightweight, instantaneous focus, great bokeh, low light performance, super sharp, and cheap. You could buy these things anywhere for next to nothing, new or used. So, of course, when I came full circle and got back to Micro Four Thirds and bought a Panasonic, I thought, hey, Olympus f1.8, my 45, love this thing, perfect. But I had an opportunity to try the Panasonic 42.5 f1.7. And what's shocking is that the very first thing I did was, before I go out into the real world and then end up with a facepalm moment or regretting time wasted or anything else, I'm going to search the internet. I'm going to see how these things actually compare. Maybe Google or Reddit or Flickr or DP Review or YouTube or somebody, Steve Huff Photos, David Thorpe, somebody can just tell me straight out, hey, which lens is better. And for the first time in the history of the internet, nope. It's like a fracture in space-time. I found the missing link somehow in a world where every piece of gear has been compared to everything else. We have people comparing a first generation iPhone to a 5D Mark IV, see which one has better bokeh. Like, every comparison, even the really stupid ones, have been done, and somehow nobody had made this very simple, obvious comparison. Hey, which one of these lenses is better? Because they're both the short portrait. This is the Olympus 45-1.8, gives you the equivalent of a 90mm lens. This gives you the 85. This is an f1.8, which on the 45 means it has a 25mm aperture opening. This is f1.7, which on a 42.5 means you have a 25mm aperture opening. So they are both small, they're both lightweight, they're both around 85, 90mm, short portrait lens. They both have a 25mm aperture opening. They're both for Micro Four Thirds, and they're both cheap. Depending on which sale is going on, they're basically the same price. And nobody ever decided to just compare. No professional reviewer, nobody, and it blows my mind. I decided I've got to try these out. I've got to actually see which is better, because I'll be honest, I am biased towards the Olympus. I love this lens. This was my diamond in the rough, apocalypse, desert island, just ride or die. Like, I love this lens, and I'm not hesitant to say it. I am biased towards this lens. So this Panasonic is going to have to buy me a very expensive dinner and do some miraculous things in order to convince me that it's more worth it than my beloved Olympus. And that's where it gets interesting.
So hidden right here, very hidden away, not meant to see it, not advertised proudly, is that this lens was actually made in China. Whereas the Panasonic was actually made in Japan. And as you can see, they're a little more proud of that. They put it right there on the outside of the lens. So I would give that a point for the Panasonic. As far as the size and feel, the Panasonic is a little bit larger. However, although it's a larger lens and it has OIS, it actually feels a little more hollow and plasticky than the Olympus. The Olympus feels, though smaller, and technically lighter, it feels more substantial. It feels more dense, which again is, considering it's smaller and doesn't have OIS, it's kind of impressive that it feels as dense and solid as it does, since there's technically less in it and it's physically smaller. The rear elements appear to be about the same size, at least visually. The Olympus might be a little larger. The front element is larger on the Panasonic though. I would give this as a point to the to the Olympus. It actually feels better in the hand, if I had to be honest. Now, instinctively, just because I typically keep a rear cap on the lens, I weighed these first with the rear caps on, and the Olympus weighed in at 122 grams and the Panasonic at 132 grams. So only a 10-gram difference, which is kind of negligible in my opinion. But if you remove the caps and you're not weighing empty plastic and you're just weighing the lens itself, the Olympus comes in at 116 grams, whereas the Panasonic comes in at 123 grams. So there's now only a 7-gram difference. So whereas the Panasonic is technically heavier, it oddly doesn't feel that way in the hand. I don't know who to give a point to. I think the difference is negligible. Now, these photos were taken on a tripod, so the exact same position. You'll notice the Panasonic looks a little bit further away because it is 85 millimeter equivalent rather than 90 of the Olympus. When we zoom in, you can see that 400% zoom or a 4:1. The Olympus still looks very sharp, very contrasty. So does the Panasonic. Hard to see a difference, so I cut in a little bit closer. And at this point, I'm starting to notice that although the image quality is breaking down a little bit and they look almost identical, if I'm looking at it side by side, the first thing that stands out to me is that depending on where I'm looking in the image, I might give a slight benefit to the Olympus or a slight benefit to the Panasonic. But then the small little barcode over on the right-hand side caught my attention. Now, I don't know if it's going to show up in the YouTube video, but on my monitor looking in Lightroom zoomed in, I could see that there is more chromatic aberration between the barcode, the lines of the barcode on the Olympus than on the Panasonic. This isn't necessarily mean that it's worse, since it can be corrected pretty easily in post-processing, but technically straight out of camera, the Panasonic is a little bit cleaner as it doesn't have as much chromatic aberration. But other than that small difference, I'd say they're almost identical. One big difference is the close focusing. The Olympus, you can get relatively close, but the Panasonic gets much closer. As a matter of fact, I was taking a series of photos to get as close as possible to a subject and then started showing how much of a difference it makes side by side. If you look at the specs on paper, it says the maximum reproduction ratio on the Olympus is like 0.1, whereas on the Panasonic it's 0.2. So it's quite a substantial difference. So if close focusing, being able to get close to something makes a difference to you, that's definitely a point in favor of Panasonic, and it actually is something I prefer. Now for the bokeh test, I wanted to keep the cameras at the same distance, but both wide open. I had never noticed this before, but you can see a very obvious difference in the bokeh rendition. The Olympus, I knew from experience, gives perfectly round, glowing, beautiful bokeh when there's lights in the background. Like in this case, it's Christmas lights in the background. And it wasn't until I set the Panasonic up in the exact same position that I realized that the bokeh actually looks kind of jagged. It caught my attention so much that I actually thought that maybe I had accidentally stopped it down. So I double and triple checked to make sure that it was in fact wide open. But it was no mistake. The Olympus is being shot at f1.8. The Panasonic is being shot at f1.7. They're in the exact same distance from the subject. And the bokeh just looks much, much better on the Olympus, in my opinion. I actually then took another photo with the Panasonic, getting as close as I possibly could, thinking that maybe with a closer focus, since the Olympus was at minimum focus, if I put the Panasonic at minimum focus, maybe the bokeh would look better, but it doesn't. As you can see, the bokeh got larger, but the shape and overall appearance is just as jagged and kind of ugly. So that was a big disappointment. So for bokeh, I definitely have to give the point to the Olympus. The the blurry backgrounds in normal circumstances look relatively the same, but when you start having highlights and actual bokeh balls in the background, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly that the Olympus just renders it way, way better.
In the end, it comes down to a few things that actually matter to me. I like that Panasonic is made in Japan. I like that it has image stabilization, and I really, really like that it has close focus. That's actually a really big deal for me. The fact that it focuses so close, especially compared to the Olympus, is a actual big deal for me. Although I like that it's made in Japan, at the end of the day, it kind of doesn't matter where it was made as far as my personal use with it. Like this one was made in China, and it never caused a problem for me. So although I like that it's made in Japan, that doesn't really change my photography with it. I like that it has image stabilization, whereas the Olympus doesn't. But again, my EM5 Mark II that I always had my Olympus on, that has a stabilized sensor, so that also didn't really matter. So it wouldn't really change my photography, at least not too much real world. But the thing that does make a difference, that makes a big difference for me, is that close focus. The Olympus has a reproduction ratio of like 0.1, and this has 0.2. And when you actually see the photos side by side, you can see a very visible difference in how close the Panasonic gets. When you actually have the camera in your hand and you're walking up to something or kneeling down on something or just trying to get a really quick photo, I've never been too close to focus. Like, you think about the subjects you typically photograph with the short portrait lens, and you can get all the normal short portrait photos plus also some really tight, especially close shots like on small things. And I've never once been too close with the Panasonic. It doesn't run out of focus space. So unless I'm trying to do macro work, this is always going to focus when I need it to. Whereas the Olympus, many times, well, not many, multiple times, frequently enough that I remember it, it did hit a focus limit. It can take portraits of people just fine, but if you want to get tight on the person's face, maybe like up close to their eyes, you're going to be too close. If you want to take a photo of something that's not a person, like up close on flowers or bugs or nature stuff, the Olympus might get too close. It's not going to be far enough away to focus. Like you just can't lock focus. So that alone in my real world photography makes me want to say I prefer the Panasonic because it makes that much of a difference. But man, I cannot ignore how much better the bokeh balls looked on the Olympus. And to be clear, that's only when it comes to like balls of light. When it comes to just typically blurring a background in general, they both have soft, blurry backgrounds. The bokeh on the Panasonic has never looked ugly or bad. It's just that in those circumstances, especially low light or at night, when you have those bokeh balls, there's just no comparison. As you saw, the ones from the Olympus, the bokeh is so perfectly round, so perfectly crisp, so soft. It's kind of flawless. This one, not so much. The Panasonic, not so much. So it actually makes it very hard for me to choose. I wish I could just keep both of them. I think most people could buy and use both of them, but then you start running into problems with redundancy. You think if you need the really good bokeh, you have your Olympus, and if you need the really close focus, you have your Panasonic. But in real world scenarios, you're not going to carry two nearly identical lenses just for that one difference, and you might not have the time to switch them out for that one difference. So it's hard to say. I'm not one of those guys that intentionally comes to a stalemate where I say, oh well, guess it's up to you, subscribe. Like, I'm not that guy. I want to find which one is just better, and it's legitimately really hard in this case. Made in Japan, image stabilization, focus is much closer, and very good image quality. Very sharp, very clear, very little chromatic aberration. Good quality lens. it just falls short on that perfect bokeh ball, but still pretty good bokeh. Whereas this, a little bit smaller, but not much. A little bit lighter, not much. No image stabilization, does not focus nearly as close, but it does have really good bokeh. So it pains me to say this, but if I could only have one, and I am gonna sell one of these when I get done with this video, gonna have to say Ollie, I love you, but I'm posting this one for sale. It's made in China, no image stabilization, doesn't focus nearly close enough. For nearly the same money, in many cases the exact same money, this one's made in Japan. It has image stabilization. It focuses much closer. It has less chromatic aberration. The only trade-off being that in the back of my mind, I will know that no matter how good I can get the bokeh to look out of this lens, there's going to be that little voice in the back of my head saying, it would have looked better on the Olympus, but I'll have to live with that. Hope this video was helpful. I hope I helped somebody. If not, oh well, I helped myself. This is a question that's really been bugging me for quite a long time. And I have gone back and checked so many times to see if somebody finally just put these two lenses head to head. I mean, I'm obviously not a scientist. Was not a lab. I'm just a guy with a camera who takes photos, and my experience taking actual real photos was the video you just saw. But anyway, there's no AC in here. I live in Taiwan, in Southeast Asia, coming up on summer. It's very hot, so I'm gonna go get my hair cut, take a shower, relax a little bit, and take some more photos, I guess. Thank you for watching. Until next time, bye.